观众朋友们好，感谢大家来到本期的思想先驱报节目现场。在今天的节目中，我们为您介绍的是来自《经济学人》的一篇文章：民主体制到底有没有利于经济增长啊？其实经济学家在这一点上可以说是达成的少数的为数不多的学界的共识。有数十年对于政治体制与经济繁荣之间的研究，最后得出的结论是，的确，民主体制的国家往往长期经济上更过繁荣。独裁者或许可以控制国家资源和社会的大部分，但是有长期选举和相关良性机构的国家，往往政府更值得信赖，财政部门和法律体系也更加称职，更值得可靠啊。2019年的时候呢，有这样的一篇经济论文，后来不仅仅是在经济学界，在国际政治界也迎来了很大的影响，就是来自于 MIT 的Jerome Acemoglu 的阿西莫格鲁。我们之前的节目中也为大家介绍到他与合作者进行了一个简单的思想实验，把所有的国家大致按照他们的政体分为独裁和民主国家。结果发现一个国家如果能够顺利的完成从独裁国家到民主国家的转型，25年之后的 GDP 大概比转型前没有完成转型的这一些国家要高出1/5左右。但是阿西格莫鲁以及他的合作者也承认一个问题，为什么呢？就是实现这一种转型所需的时间和代价往往比我们想象的要更加简单。同时作者也提出了一个问题，就是民主国家也是各不相同的，独裁国家的独裁程度也是不一样的。简简单单把一个国家归为民主或者是专制，这样的一个非黑即白的划分方式也许不加科学啊。那比如说像美国这样的国家，可能有100年的民主历史，它的民主的良性程度和一个刚刚完成了某一种政治运动建立新型民主政权的国家，如果归在一类，那么可能并不科学合理。在这一方面最著名的是来自伦敦大学的一位学者，叫做坎波斯。他在去年发表了一项研究，其中就提出了一个更为微妙的问题，就是一个独裁专制政权在试图摆脱专制体制的时候，往往会遇到各种各样的难题。换句话说，大家普遍认同民主制度从长远而言是比专制制度更适于经济发展的制度，但是在由专制制度再向民主制度转型的时候，往往可能有各种各样的挑战。这样的研究发现了一个什么样的结论呢？在摆脱独裁统治之后的25年里，各国的人均国民生产总值，也就是我们说的人均 GDP 还有和之前的增长速度相比，往往会出现下降，而下降的幅度可达20%。过渡的时候正是一个国家举步维艰的时候。这样的过渡政权在全世界范围有多少呢？或者叫做中间政权，就是正在进行从专制向民主的某一些转变，但是还没有完成民主转型的国家。如果我们看到经济学人信息情报部的数据，这样的国家总共有87个，可以说在整个世界上占到半壁江山的，既不是民主国家，也不是绝对的独裁国家，而是介于独裁和民主之间的某一种过渡体制国家，或者我们叫做中间政权。为什么会出现这样的结果呢？来自经济学人的分析认为，首先我们认同可靠的制度是发展的先决条件，但是这样制度的建立和完善往往需要很长的时间。如果我们看到军事独裁者对于一个国家的统治，可能之前一天还战火延烧，结果第二天就出现完整的最高法院了，知道怎样让私人部门参与公务员制度，知道怎样保护财产权，有良性的法律制度，有良性的大学机构，这简直是天方夜谭。我们刚才提到的，不管是法律制度、保护财产的有关条例，还是能够让私营部门参与国家治理的公务员制度，建立起来可能需要几十年甚至更长久的时间才能够发展起来。而在面临一个新生政权的时候，投资者往往也充满了疑虑，他们需要更长的时间才能够被说服。民主国家的确在医疗和教育方面投入更多，平均而言质量也更好，但是这一种医疗、教育和社会基本服务的完善，往往也需要几十年的时间。而更加微妙的一点是， 彻底的政治改革有的时候恰恰会破坏经济发展的基础。的确，经济学人这一篇文章分析啊，我们知道这个专制者呀，很少是真正意义上开明明智的技术官僚，民主进步往往一波三折，即使是推翻了专制者之后，偶尔甚至还出现倒退。国家往往需要好几代的领导人，好几部的新宪法的不断的完善改革，才可以继续坚持下去。民主实验有的时候甚至是以政变、战争或者是起义告终。而对于企业而言，在一个新生政权还十分脆弱的时候，往往他们更希望把钱放在稳定的国家。如果当地的企业与政客走得太近，很有可能导致再出一次政变或者是政权更替之后，这一些企业激怒下一任的掌权者。而外国的债权人也希望贷款可以发给一个确保能够还钱的稳定政府。这就是为什么我们看到很多转型国家明明在政治制度上出现了某一种良性的特征，在经济发展上却出现了倒退。另外，经济学人这篇文章啊也告诉我们，选举并不是毫无成本的，专制者需要解决的问题往往复杂而且昂贵，但是一个新型的民主国家的政治家面临的任务往往更加昂贵。为什么呢？比如施加影响需要资金，有的时候施加影响形成某一种政治联盟所需要的资源，比单纯的简单的暴力镇压还要更加的昂贵。一个由政党经营的媒体帝国，像美国这样，有的媒体更偏共和党，有的媒体更偏民主党，这个媒体金额可能造价要数十亿美元。如果赢得选票的福利承诺真正实现，可能还要更加昂贵。新成立新当选的民主政权的领导人，有的时候甚至也会选择依靠裙带资本主义盟友网络来帮助他们竞选、保护和资助他们。这一些资助人网络可能比他们前任独裁者掌权的时候更加强大。来自经济学人的这一篇文章就引述学界的分析表示，不管是将军、商人，还是有权有势的权贵高层，还是他们的选民，往往对于减薪、生活水平下降都不热衷。这就意味着候选人自己必须真正富有，并且有足够多的影响力和财力资源，可以支付选民的报酬，给选民带来更加优惠的条件。这就导致财政的收支平衡很有可能会在民主政权上台之后更加陷入缺口。有的时候，民主政权的领导人也可因此陷入腐败。在下一次选举的时候，腐败的领导人可能会落败，但是有的时候，这样的落败却可能使得寻租的活动变得更加紧迫，而不是让未来民主政权的竞争者望而却步。有的时候，新上任的政府并不会解散国营公司，而是将董事会职位作为奖励，为国家垄断企业发放各种各样的许可。公务员队伍易手，有很多投资原来在之前政权的旗舰地，反而是转移到了他们自己的新的领地，或者是他们的权力堡垒。尽管这样的变革代价高昂，但是引发变革的环境也十分的重要。再来回到刚才我们所说的 MIT 的这一位经济学者阿奇莫格鲁的发现，他发现在一个国家成为民主国家之前的5年里，往往人均 GDP 会停止增长。比如印尼的前独裁者苏哈托在1998年辞职，刚刚亚洲金融危机爆发1年。再比如在2011年的时候，埃及的解放广场上挤满了要求面包、尊严和自由的抗议者。在现在，斯里兰卡和巴基斯坦也是有很多政治的不明确，伴随着经济的萧条而产生。但是在一次又一次的危机，一次又一次的政权更迭之后，我们看到这一些国家的政治体系和经济面貌都没有出现真正长足的改变。是什么原因可以推动政治家进行改革，或者是政治体制进行变革呢？的确，很大程度上是经济原因，通货膨胀、失业和生活水平下降都有可能会推动民众走上街头进行抗议。很多这些问题都是专制者一手造成的。但是经济学人的这一篇文章也提醒我们，转型更复杂，更换领导人或者是单单举行选举，并不是解决数十年来积蓄经济管理不上问题的灵丹妙药。民主化的困境 在《经济学人》的这一篇作者看来，也可以帮助我们解释为什么有如此多的国家都受困于全面民主的悖论。民众投票的确可以带来利益的合理分享，但是很多这一些利益需要时间才能够显现，而这一种代价则更为直接。推翻专制统治之后啊，很多民主领导人也向他们的子民许下了宏伟的诺言，但是如果大家发现维持生计成了问题，国家经济再次陷入萧条，人民对于改革的热情也有可能会放弃。因此，《经济学人》的这一篇文章最后得出的结论是，民主之路充满荆棘，而历史上失败的民主实验比比皆是。今天呢，我们简单为大家介绍《经济学人》的这一篇文章，这其实正是和明先生之前多次思考的一个话题，在节目中呢，也经常与我们的观众朋友们进行分享，就是一个国家的转型到底是怎样完成的。在今天早上的华尔街论坛节目中啊，我们恰恰也谈到了这个问题。来自南华早报的一篇文章啊，向我们介绍了一个独家的有趣的细节，就是在之前2个任期内以亲自指挥、亲自部署、事无躬亲著称的习近平，在第3个任期刚开始的时候啊，突然下放了一些权力。习近平是不是有改革的意愿呢？与政治改革相比，中国走出经济困境可能是更加迫在眉睫的这样的一个眼前必须要解决的问题。如果历史规律正确的话，经济上出现的不确定性可能也会让中国人民对于国家的前途失去信心，甚至有可能让投资者对于中国改变口味，转身离去。所有这些问题都是不得不改，眼下就得改的有关问题。那么中国转型到底应该怎样转型？是不是眼下就必须变，还是说中国转型可能需要一个更长的时间线？今天我们就听何明先生的建议。
今天我们的系统出了一点小小的这个技术性的问题，但是倒还没有完全修好。刚才的节目的延迟主要是跟这个有一些关系啊。现在我们导播可以把画面进入这个现场。OK， 现在好像可以了啊，单声道的问题还没有解决。这当然是一个非常大的一个话题啊，不是一时间呢可以讲清楚的。但是我觉得现在的有一些好的迹象，就是通过这个冷战之后啊，人们的对民主的那种引爆啊，那种热情，对自由的渴望啊，通过冷战的几十年的这种2个阵营之间的对抗啊，实际上大家得出了一个结论，就是一个现代的一个国家经济的长期繁荣个人的尊严、权利的保障靠的就是民主靠的就是市场经济。但是冷战之后一系列的这个政权的转型中国共产党发生了这个6次的大屠杀改革开放，这是改革开放之后产生的。而苏联和东欧经过崩溃之后发动了好几场这个战争从这个格鲁吉亚吧还有之前的著名的科斯夫危机波海战争，到现在仍然在进行的这个俄罗斯侵略乌克兰的战争。更不用说在冷战期间已经进行了转型的东南亚的国家他们从传统的国家转向了民主的国家，有的国家实现了君主立宪那么在拉丁美洲我们就更清楚，很多的国家实际上是一个浪漫理想的试验场基本上军事政变也发生过，抗议示威发生过兵变也发生过然后各种各样的改革政策也进行过，极左极右都存在。那么非洲我们看到了这个非洲很多的国家实际上已经走向了形式上的这种民主这种形式上的民主到底带来了什么呢？那我们再看欧洲除了我们刚才讲的苏东之后，我们看看西欧看看北欧看看南欧再回到我们的美国看看最近这些年民主的品质怎么样。所以这些变化从冷战前后的那种对民主的一种淳朴的向往淳朴的 追求淳朴的争取，已经变得了大家有了更多的思考。现在对美国民主检讨、欧洲民主检讨，或者对全世界的民主的检讨的学术文章，其实在10几年中间呢，就已经出现了不少。但是呢，这些学术文章始终没有确定一个国际关系到底是一个什么国际关系。以前很好很简单，热战大家打仗，冷战互相对立。但是现在到底是一个全球是一什么关系？有人说是新冷战这是实在是缺乏想象力的一个就此的利用。那么呢还有人说呢，为了面临都酝酿一场大的这个战争，那各个国家的这个转型，中小国家我们已经发现了过去这些年街头革命、颜色革命甚至是政变所产生的这些转型，现在西方媒体你很少有人今天在讨论这个茉莉花革命今天在讨论颜色革命，因为这些国家都说了或者我不能说完全都说，也没经过精确的统计或者相当多的其实是非常失败，非常失败，比过去还要糟糕国家分裂，甚至陷入内战经济上这种贫困。这就是在一种我们30年来、40年来对很多的问题的思考，应该进入了一个新的一个层次。这个层次就是说了，实际上我们应该怎么看待今天的世界的局势，怎么看待世界的格局？在我看起来，用民主和独裁的方式来划分这个世界，实际上是一个旧有的意识形态。实际上，相当多的国家已经没有办法形成传统上的独裁国家。不要说国内的这个政治不能允许，民主已经开放。但是呢，另一方面，国际社会也很难认可一个真正意义上的一个独裁者。实际上，独裁者已经呢无处可乘，可以说是无处可乘。但是呢，内独裁或者是内民主或者是灰色地带的这个体制，越来越占有这个主体的地位。原因就是呢，有些国家通过一个民主的选举，咱极左往这个极右方向走然后又从极右又走极左，它在不断的摇摆和调试中间。比如说阿根廷，比如说巴西，你就会看到巴西刚刚送走一个小川普，阿根廷有可能会迎来了一个这个阿根廷的川普那么你在各个国家的摇摆，你都可以发现了一种特别的这种现象。但是同时呢，你有注意到一批中型国家，他们在这个传统的这个体制和新型体制中间是摇摆不定的你可以说他在某种程度上民主倒退，但是你也可以说他的政治光谱更加丰富你比如像印尼你比如像越南你比如说像印度你就是说像这个沙特你可以说像巴西你可以说土耳其。那么这些国家的光谱的扩大呢，实际上是反映了世界上的潮流的真正的面目，那就是实际上传统上的民主、传统上的专制不是简单的就类比这个缺点。西方的民主出了很多的问题，那些传统的独裁者统治它也很难以生存。其实彼此呢是在向对方一些传统上简单否定的体制在学习。比如说某一些行政的效率，某一些处事情的方式，某一些国家的力量。你看到这些年西方在抨击中国的一带一路，抨击中国的国家的经济干预，这个国家的力量去推动某一些经济的发展国家力量做什么事情。这个从传统的市场经济来讲，或者是是采取比较否定的态度，但是实际上你看看咱拜登总统开的会，咱欧洲开的会，都可以发现出来了，他们实际上在某种方式上用中国的方式来对付中国，也就是说实际上是学习了中国的一些东西。当然中国更多的是学习了西方。今天的中国之所以变得如此的强大，如此的富有，它不是学的马克思主义，不是学的列宁主义，不是呢自己真正创造了一 独特的一种这个政治的生态，而是说呢，在技术上、在专业上学习了西方的这样一种结果，再加上自己的本身的一些特质，民众的聪明、民众的勤奋、市场的统一化和强大，很多的因素造成了今天的全球化的一个体制也好，意识形态也好国家这个统治方式也好，民众心态也好，其实是越来越接近，而不是越来越对立。但是政客们呢，为了鼓励自己的民众很容易把这个事情呢，把这些还在转型过程中的国家呢列为这个独裁。这种方式当然是有利于他的选票，有利于他的鼓动他民众的这样的爱国之心，但是呢，造成今天的国际关系没有办法比较理性的去面对它。但是它也不能说完全是负面的，因为这样一种批评这样一种监督比如说对中国的人权问题的监督，对中国的人权和法治的改善是有帮助的。但是西方的虚伪就在于呢，就是说一方面抨击中国毫无疑问是对的，但是另一方面对印度这种人权非常严重的国家宗教信仰非常严重的国家至于呢可以说几乎是视而不见。这就是反映出来了西方政客的某一些短视，也使得他的政治的道德力并不像他讲的那么强大。但是这就是国际现实主义，国际现实主义尤其是给中国的这个精英分子应该有一等更丰富的一个学习的这个机会，一个更丰富的一个理解的机会。但是呢，中国政府现在的这种对异议人士的打压，对空间的挤压，有时候过分的动员这个民粹主义的力量甚至关于一些呢大家早就抛弃的意识形态，这又增加了大家很多的对中国民主转型的这样政治转型的或者是社会转型的这一种焦虑感一种愤怒，各等力量都在互相的拉扯。但是整体来讲，为什么是值得乐观的一个原因就是呢，现在的一等暴力革命台湾另外一个政权的基地是越来越低，或者是变得越来越不被大家期待。我注意到白俄罗斯的这么一个声势浩大的抗议，这后面还是由这个传统的独裁者继续掌握权力。原因还不是说白俄罗斯的民众不够勇敢，而是国际社会对这个民众的抗议所带来的一个未来缺乏了一种希望的动力。这就是给一个平和的变革其实带来了一个比较好的一个环境但当然各的力量都在互相牵扯之中。我们很难说几年之后假如说中国经济崩溃完蛋，它可能会产生另外一个形态出来。但是如果在这个转型过程中间，经济最终还是能够稳妥下去，或者是不会走向极端化，那么它这个平缓的转型之路会继续下去。正如这篇文章讲的，你要希望在几年之内出现一个独立的可以尊重的司法体系，一个可敬的信任的权威的一个选举的机制那是不现实的。人呢，现在几千年来就是因为不能忍耐，所以就互相残杀；因为不能忍耐，所以暴力革命兴起；不能忍耐，所以呢，咱们就是上街运动。人类就是这么发展过来的。但是发展到今天，人们更多的开始相信，有很多的事情，时间是必要的工具，时间是必要的过程。所以我非常高兴的看到经济学人有了这样一种观点的出现。我相信更多的政治学者或者是战略家们或者政客们，尤其是包括我们的观众们，对这个转型的一些思考应该更多一些层次。经济学人给我们开了一个很好的头。
好，谢谢和平先生的介绍。今天首先要向各位观众朋友们道歉我们演播室的这个声音系统出了一些问题，所以大家可能听我们的声音只有单声道，显得比较吃力。现在呢，我们演播室的技术人员同事也在焦急的解决，希望到明天这个时候就可以恢复正常的节目。既然设备不好，那就不耽误各位的时间了。谢谢各位对于本期的思想先驱报的关注，感谢麦团，感谢金山，感谢艺人，感谢如数我们，谢谢这些观众朋友们对于我们的支持。明天同一时间，思想先驱报，明天再会。
Now, Zoe, for years we have heard about China's economic miracle. In roughly 40 years, China went from being an economic afterthought to the world's largest or second largest economy, depending on the measure you prefer. As recently as this past January, experts expected the Chinese economy to come roaring back after nearly 3 years of zero COVID policy. But for the last several months, all I've been seeing is a drumbeat of bad news coming out of China. Let me just cite some statistics. Manufacturing has contracted for the fourth straight month. Chinese exports in July were down nearly 15% year over year, the sharpest contraction since the start of the COVID pandemic back in February 2020. Net foreign direct investment just hit its lowest level in 2 decades. So I have to ask you, Zoe, how much trouble is the Chinese economy in?
Jim, all these headline news numbers are bad news. Even this morning, Financial Times, Bloomberg came out in news to say China is not just flirting with deflationary pressure, but officially entered into a deflationary status, both consumer price and producer price down year on year in July. I would argue that this is perhaps too early to say this is going to be the peak moment of the Chinese economy and China is going to decline from here on. And the reason I say that is because there are different ways that one can measure the power of the world's second largest economy. And if we are only looking at the GDP growth number, actually China already peaked because the fastest time of China's double-digit growth was already gone. And it was about 10 years ago when China was growing at 14% in terms of GDP growth.
But to be fair to the Chinese, no economy is going to grow at double digits in perpetuity because the bigger you get, it is hard to maintain that rate of economic growth. So even the Chinese expected that their growth rates would fall over time. My sense is they've fallen farther and faster than Chinese planners expect, and I think farther and faster than many Western experts predicted.
I think you are right, Jim. And I think a lot of the current challenges that we are observing now is not necessarily caused by President Xi Jinping or, for that matter, zero COVID policies. I remember what you described, earlier this year, people were predicting that China would be roaring back and we would see a rapid recovery. And yet we didn't.
Yeah, and people were worried because you were going to get inflation around the globe because China would be out there buying things, driving up prices.
Exactly. I guess I have always been a contrarian from that point. In November last year, I wrote an article saying that China's economic problem is more than just zero COVID. Even China ended zero COVID, the economy won't be bouncing back very soon. And in January, I wrote another article saying that to what extent the Chinese economy can recover is going to be dependent on confidence, and in particular, household confidence. And at that time, it seemed that I was wrong, but now it seems that market consensus is moving towards my analysis.
Well, Zoe, I give you credit for that. You did call it late last year that we weren't going to see the kind of boom that many people were predicting. I want to drill down a bit more on the nature of the economic challenges that China faces. As you point out, it's not simply a matter of overall growth numbers. There are a variety of subsidiary issues, one of which I'd like to hear you talk about, and that is the sharp jump in youth unemployment. As I understand it, official figures, and I don't know how accurate the official figures are in China, something on the order of 1 out of 5 Chinese youths are unemployed. I believe this has been an issue discussed widely in China, and President Xi Jinping's response to it has been to tell Chinese youth that they need to learn to eat bitterness. I guess that is the Mandarin equivalent of telling someone to suck it up, buttercup. So help me understand the issue with youth unemployment.
Jim, you are right to question to what extent the number itself is precise. And I would argue that the actual youth unemployment number would actually be much higher than that, and to the magnitude somewhere between 45 to even 50%. And the reason I say it could be as that high is because the official statistics only focus on a very narrow band. They focus on city-dwelling youth aged between 16 years old and 24 years old. That is very narrow. That basically means for college graduates, you are already above 24 years old. You are not counted towards these statistics, right? So therefore, I think the actual situation could probably be worse than that. And it's very likely to be worse than that. And I would argue that there are probably two direct factors contributed to the high youth unemployment. One is related to the skill set mismatch. And that is also a reason that the Chinese government oftentimes cite. That's why President Xi Jinping basically called out the youth to say, suck it up. But the deeper down, I would say the skill set mismatch, deeper down, is deeply intertwined with, on the one hand, the slowdown of the Chinese economy itself, and then the so-called de-risking as global multinationals either contemplate leaving China or slow down their investment in China. So that basically means all these fancy white-collar jobs that these highly trained youth thought they would get into, those job opportunities were no longer there. And earlier this year, the State Council also cut civil servant employment number for this year. So all in all, that basically means you have a whole generation of highly educated, highly aspiring young people when they enter into job market realizing the jobs are not there.
I imagine, Zoe, that the expectation of China's youths could be quite significant here because they expect to be able to live a much better life than their parents or grandparents did. And again, sort of the situation of the average Chinese citizen in 2023 is remarkably better, at least in a material sense, than it was in 1956 or 1966. But that leads me to another question, which is sort of the opposite side of the age spectrum, which is the question of China's ability to support its rapidly aging population. A lot has been made of the fact that China is getting old before it gets rich. Can you give us a sense of that aspect of the demographic issue and how that plays into the economy? Because I imagine some people are wondering, well, if a lot of Chinese are retiring, doesn't that create a lot of jobs for young Chinese?
Right. Theoretically speaking, yes, as older people retire, perhaps there would be job opportunities being created. But that is based upon the assumption that there will be job available and there is no automation. The reality is actually there is the labor substitution effect created by artificial intelligence, robotics, what have you.
Technology.
Absolutely technology. But I would take a step back by saying that technology itself or demographic change itself, neither of those would be a crisis. Human society lived through industrialization, and we know how to deal with this labor substitution effect. And then demographic challenges themselves are not necessarily a crisis because as long as you have the right set of policies to deal with it, you should be able to create a cushion. And by creating a cushion, I mean create a support network or strengthen welfare support for Chinese families and the elderly. But the reality is that China's pension system is actually very underdeveloped by several metrics. And the pension system, especially at the local government level right now, is particularly under stress because, the country just lived through close to 3 year zero COVID policy, and it created a lot of financial stress on local government because on the one hand, the government revenue declined, and then on the other hand, massive zero COVID testing incurred a lot of expenditures.
I think the way you put it in one of your recent articles is that China's pension system is buckling under an aging population.
That is correct. And the reason why I highlighted aging population is because China is not just aging, but also aging at a faster speed. And the World Health Organization had some rigorous estimation, and the estimate suggests that within the next 2 decades, there will be more Chinese elderly, meaning people above the age of 60, than the entire US population. So from that perspective, demographics is not necessarily on China's side.
You don't know, Zoe, how much it hurts me to hear you define elderly as being over the age of 60, but I won't pursue that avenue. Instead, I want to talk about the fact that all economies go through tough patches. I am old enough to remember the 1970s here in the United States when we talked about a misery index. Of course, we had the great financial recession of 2008, 2009, yet the United States in both instances came roaring back. So I'm wondering, when we talk about China's economic problems, do you see them as being temporary or secular?
Before I answer your question, Jim, I will say, personally, I do think we need to raise what we define as elderly because 60 is perhaps too young to be considered as elderly. And many people would argue 60s are the new 30s.
That's how I feel, Zoe. I will sign your petition.
Great. And in terms of whether this is secular or not, I would argue that it's probably too early to tell. Because if we take a longer term horizon, China after Tiananmen was the moment where I often compare China then and China now. Because China after Tiananmen went through a period of Western sanctions, but that period of Western sanction was short-lived. And what you observe was that Chinese policymakers, especially Deng Xiaoping, quickly came out in 1992 and injected a very healthy dose of confidence in the Chinese economy and to the world with his famous Southern tour of China, where he emphasized that China is going to stick with reform and open up. And I was just revisiting his speech, and I was surprised and even to a certain extent embarrassed that I did not even recognize this before. In one of his passages, he said, "It is okay to not have new ideas as long as we do not do things that make people think we are going to change the policy of reform and open up." But now I think what the Chinese government or the Communist Party has been doing exactly the opposite. We've seen major policy swings. We've also seen President Xi Jinping search for great ideas, from dual circulation to the construction of shared human destiny. And these are exactly against the prescription given by Deng Xiaoping. And what we observe now is not necessarily that he caused a lot of these structural problems, but he made it worse. And right now in the economic world, people talk about vibecession. The idea is that economic indicators are actually good, but people think we are going to have a recession. Therefore, people practice cautionary practice. And I think this is exactly perhaps the opposite in China. On the one hand, you do see government tries to say everything is good and China is still the leading growth engine of the world, without realizing that there are so many structural problems. And I would argue that under President Xi Jinping's leadership, a lot of the damage to the economy is not necessary to the economy itself, it's confidence at three different levels. On the one hand, it's Chinese people, Chinese household confidence to their own economic security. The second level would be international investors' confidence in whether China is going to stick with reform and open up. They have lost confidence. And the third would be China's increased frequency of practicing coercive economic statecraft by using export controls and all that, basically damaged the confidence of the West in particular, in terms of whether China is still very much interested in a peaceful rise.
Okay, there's a lot there, Zoe. Let's try to unpack it. As I understand it, you look at China, you have a whole variety of macro forces that are operating. You have demographics, you have technology, you have the broader global economy. Obviously, China is a country that exports a lot, can be hurt if other countries are undergoing a recession. You also have sort of things that aren't necessarily structural, like swings in policy. As you note, the Chinese government has gone through a series of different campaigns, or at least has labeled things differently over the past several years, and that affects psychology. That is, people's expectations about what's going to happen in the future colors their behavior in the present day. If you think a flood is about to come, you head for high ground. If you think sunshine is breaking out, you're going to break out the beach chairs and the sunscreen. I get all of that. What I'm trying to understand is, to what extent is the problem rooted in Xi Jinping's decision to insert the state more into the economy since 2015? Is that the bigger issue, that there's more state involvement? Or is the more important thing that Xi Jinping chooses a strategy, comes up with a name, and then 6 months later changes it? I mean, most famously, as you've written, you had, we're going to stick with zero COVID, zero tolerance, up until the moment we're going to throw it out the window as if it never existed. So I'm trying to understand how much of this is about sort of swings in policy versus a trend which we have seen, which is greater state involvement in the economy.
I would argue that the current status of the Chinese economic downturn is mostly related to swings in policies and the changes. And the reason that I am suspicious with regard to state involvement is because the Chinese state has always been there. I'm aware that people are arguing the fact that China became increasingly authoritarian hurt the economy. But I would even argue that even Deng Xiaoping, the great mind of reform and open up, he is very suspicious of the idea of liberalism, and in particular, liberalism in the Western sense. And if anything, the way that he managed Tiananmen shows that he's a great authoritarian leader. And there is a pretty good argument to be made that if an authoritarian regime is committed authoritarianly to develop and prioritize economic development, and if such an authoritarian regime is committed to reform and open up, it actually delivers economic miracle. But what we have observed since President Xi Jinping came to power is that he has increasingly ambitious agenda, not just at home, but globally. And his expansive ambition comes at a time of economic slowdown in terms of growth. That becomes the problem.
Well, let me ask you about that, because you grew up in China. You have an innate, intuitive sense of how Chinese politics work. I know you must chat with a lot of people back in China. Do you think that this economic slowdown could threaten Xi's hold on power?
I would argue that economic slowdown in itself is not hurting his ruling. But economic slowdown combined with a sense of American containment would actually strengthen rather than undermine his power. Because with America's export controls, and President Biden recently signed the outbound investment screening regime, so a lot of this gives President Xi Jinping an excuse to say, to describe to Chinese people that a lot of your sufferings today, or for that matter, Chinese youth, a lot of your unemployment problem today is not necessarily because of the party is not delivering growth. We are still trying to do a lot to help you have a better future, but it is American hegemonic power that tries to contain China and even stop China's growth.
So this is a traditional policy of blame avoidance and blame shifting.
Exactly.
I'm not the one who's responsible for the bad things that are happening. I mean, this seems to be a standard play in a lot of politicians' playbooks, certainly in a lot of autocrats' playbooks.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, the leadership of Cuba, the leadership of Venezuela,
mm-hmm.
for years and decades, in the case of Cuba, have blamed all their economic woes on the United States. Not our fault.
Mm-hmm.
It's the great Yankee to the north. So this is not an unknown phenomenon in world politics.
Right, absolutely. And perhaps Xi Jinping, despite his search for great ideas, he also subscribes to blame others for his own problems.
So do you worry that this might lead to a more nationalist, more assertive, more belligerent Chinese foreign policy as Xi looks to play to nationalist sentiment, given that he may be less able to provide the kind of economic growth and benefits that Chinese citizens have become used to and are hoping for?
I do become increasingly worried in terms of how the party and the Chinese government is going to play with regard to nationalism. Because traditionally, we argue that we think that nationalism is a double-edged sword, and especially in a non-democratic regime, right? But when economy is slowing down and the party has growing ambitions, then how to finance a lot of these ambitions become a problem. Now, in order to finance a lot of these ambitions, what end up happening would be the government has to practice harsher and harsher financial repression. The idea is implement more tighter capital controls and lower interest rate or cap the interest that depositors can keep. So a lot of these would, on the one hand, further damage Chinese people's confidence in their economic security, and then on the other hand, make them more susceptible to different argument that the government is going to present in terms of who actually caused the economic problem at the household level. Now, the reason I worry Chinese people may increasingly subscribe to the argument that America caused it is because, on the one hand, we are still not seeing a lot of American people coming to China. And there is still no direct flight between New York or DC and Beijing. And then on the other hand, there are not a lot of Chinese students. Student exchange are still not resumed to pre-pandemic level. So a lot of this makes me worried in terms of what if Chinese people think blaming America, blaming the West, become an easy scapegoat so that they can lash out their problems. And if it's not America, perhaps it is Japan. And even just recently on Chinese social media, people were commenting on the flood in Beijing and Hebei. And some of the comment was so nationalistic. They were even saying that, well, let the flood go to Japan, which I find is quite bizarre. I've never seen a comment like that.
Well, I will note that nationalism is a very potent force around the world, not just in China. This is not something that's restricted to the Chinese people. And I take your point that it can create sort of a self-fulfilling prophecy as this happens. And I would imagine the Chinese media environment is closed. I think my understanding is it's hard for Chinese to get access to Western media and alternative points of view. Just a quick question on the issue of the Chinese government facing slowing economic growth. And I take it that means less state revenue or more state revenue has to go to prop up state enterprises and the like. But is it your sense that the Chinese government still has the capacity in the near term, let's say 10, 15, 20 years, to continue its substantial investment in building a modern military?
I do think the Chinese government still has a lot of capacity to concentrate resources to beef up the military. Part of the reason is that, on the one hand, if you look at the composition of the Communist Party Central Committee, about 1/3 of them already have substantial science engineering background, meaning they have the know-how. And then on the other hand, China has also developed not just sovereign funds at the central government level, such as, China Investment Corporation and all those, but there are a substantial amount of other investment vehicles at the local government level, as well as state-owned policy banks that are allowed or even encouraged to invest in frontier and emerging technologies that have direct implication for the military. And then finally, President Xi Jinping apparently has been also strengthening his anti-corruption campaign into the military, as we've recently seen in terms of he replaced the top military rocket leaders, right? So from that perspective, I think on the one hand, he's trying to concentrate the resources to invest in this military-related technology or dual-use technology. And then on the other hand, he's trying to increase the efficiency of available resources by cracking down the misallocation of funds.
So let's talk a bit, Zoe, about what this means for the foreign policy choices that the United States or other Western countries make in dealing with China. I take your point that we risk getting into an echo chamber in which U.S. efforts to de-risk or challenge China can sort of create this feedback or fuel this feedback loop of more aggressive Chinese behavior. So what is the right way for the United States to approach this issue of what looks to be, at least in the near term, slowing Chinese economic growth?
I think, first of all, the United States or the Biden administration needs to separate what are the technologies that can be directly accessed by the PLA.
The PLA being the
People's Liberation Army, right? I think it's important for the Biden administration to at least set the baseline. These are the off-limit technology and send a clear message, not just to American community, both in terms of investment community or technology community, so that they are educated, that they do not unintentionally participate in strengthening China's military capacity, right? And on the other hand, Biden administration really needs to focus on sending the message clearly, convey the message, deliver the message to the Chinese leaders, saying that, well, America's true intention is not about contain China. Right now, I really do not think the message has been delivered, despite that, Secretary Yellen and Secretary Blinken and other cabinet level officials have all visited China. Viewing this from Beijing's perspective, America is doing one thing and then talking the other way. It becomes extremely difficult for the Biden administration to deliver the message. So what can be done, perhaps, is for the two countries to have some innovative diplomacy in the sense that let's just have a conversation about what are the off-limit stuff. This is the off-limit piece of paper. And then have a different set of paper to talk about these are the things that we can work on, whether it is climate change, whether it is food security, but at least we need to have two clear set of agendas so that we can deliver the message to China. We recognize there are room for us to cooperate. And we also want to let China know that China actually can continue to benefit from the existing U.S.-led system.
Let me ask you about that, Zoe, because my sense reading the Chinese reaction to a variety of Biden administration initiatives has been to say, we are not interested in delinking issues. We're not prepared to say, okay, we can talk about climate change and not let our thinking about climate change be affected by what you're doing on semiconductors. How do you get past that, especially given, as you pointed out, Xi Jinping has an incentive to blame the United States for the problems that his policy swings and a variety of structural issues are causing in terms of the Chinese economy?
That is a tough question, Jim. I would say that perhaps there is a timing issue for Beijing to want to continue the conversation and try to compartmentalize the conversation, or reluctant to put down anything in agreement. And the reason I mentioned timing is because from Beijing's perspective, America is having an election in the coming year. And there is a huge risk in terms of whether there is going to be a second Trump term or not. So from that perspective, Beijing is not completely ruling out a Trump second term. So they are betting on what if. And if there is a what if, then we would have a whole similar playbook, which I remember when Trump was elected, and there was some news interview among the Chinese people and say, do you think President Trump is good or bad for China? And one person interviewed said, well, I think President Trump is good because it seems that he's more easily to be manipulated. So from that perspective, I think Beijing is not necessarily eager to talk. And hence, perhaps that's what we observe from our perspective. We are frustrated that Beijing is not willing to talk. And then finally, perhaps our cabinet level people that can talk about certain things, but the issue that they can talk about are not necessarily on the top interest of the Chinese counterpart. For example, Beijing is interested to talk about export controls, to walk back export controls, or for that matter, phase out the tariffs. But neither cabinet level officials that have visited Beijing so far had the power to talk about those. So from that perspective, we are really in a difficult situation, and it takes some innovative thinking in terms of how to set the baseline. And perhaps setting the baseline means we need to clarify to Beijing, these are the things that obviously off the limit because of military reasons. And then on the other hand, clearly state these sets of issues are area that we can cooperate. And then finally, I would be saying that I think the Biden administration have been doing a pretty good job in terms of recognizing Beijing's trying to play a positive role in terms of welcoming Beijing's trying to play a constructive role in Ukraine's peace plan. At least the idea is no longer totally throw it out. And I think from what I read, Beijing welcomed that kind of nice gesture.